Now to another quite dramatic moment in court. Unlawful, unconstitutional, invalid. That's what the Supreme Court of Appeal has called the granting of medical parole to former President Jacob Zuma. Today, the Bloemfontein Court ruled that former Correctional Services Commissioner Arthur Fraser did not have the power to ignore a decision by the Medical Parole Advisory Board and released the former president to his home last year. You'll remember, of course, Fraser overruled the advisory board and ordered his release on medical parole, granted to Zuma barely 2 months after he'd reported to the Escort Correctional Centre for his sentence. So let's get all the details, because it's also been quite a convoluted story. Let's find out the very latest from ENCA's Moloko Moloto, who comes to us from Bloemfontein. So, Moloko, just give us a little bit of the background and take us through the ruling today.
So, Sally, just to refresh the memories of our viewers, this relates to a judgment by the Constitutional Court that said former President Jacob Zuma, because he had defied its instruction or order for him to testify before the Zondo Commission, it therefore sentenced him to 15 months behind bars. Now, the decision obviously did not sit well with Mr. Zuma and his supporters, and as a result, we saw that hardly 2 months in prison, there were moves to apply for his release on medical parole, and his physician from the South African military then put in that particular application, and it obviously had to be decided upon by the Medical Parole Advisory Board, which is a statutory body. Now, there was just one dissenting view within that board, one doctor who felt that Mr. Zuma had to be released, but the majority of the members of that board said no, he actually was not terminally ill and he was not incapacitated, and as a result, they overwhelmingly decided that he does not deserve to be released on medical parole. However, at the time, the National Commissioner of the Correctional Services, Mr. Fraser, who himself is not a medical expert, decided to overrule that board's decision, and he went ahead to release Mr. Zuma. Fast forward to where we find ourselves today, the Democratic Alliance, along with the Helen Suzman Foundation, went to the High Court in Pretoria, which in December then decided to rule against that decision by Mr. Fraser, and it ordered that Mr. Zuma ought to return to the correctional facilities to be incarcerated because he was out by then. It also importantly said that the time that Mr. Zuma had already spent outside on medical parole does not count in terms of the sentence that he ought to have served. Let's listen to Justice Tati Makgoka, who delivered that particular order. It took him less than 2 minutes, really, Sally, and we were all out. And Mr. Zuma, I must say, was not in court. Let's listen to Acting Justice Makgoka.
The order of the judgment reads as follows. 1. Paragraphs 5 and 6 of the order of the High Court are set aside. 2. Save for the above, the appeal is dismissed with costs. 3. The first and second appellants are ordered to pay the costs of the first, second, and third respondents jointly and severally, the one paying, the other to be absolved. The costs shall include the cost of 2 counsel where so employed. I hand down the judgment.
Of course, the big question is, does this mean that former President Jacob Zuma might have to go back to prison? I note the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal saying they are comforted, and I'm quoting, by the fact that President Jacob Zuma is not required by law to return to prison and therefore remains free. Following it up with this sentence, this is good for stability in this province and the country, alluding perhaps to those July riots last year when he was incarcerated. But what actually is where does the law stand on this? Is he absolutely, because he's completed his term officially, home free, quite literally?
So, Sally, let's give a little bit of context here. After that judgment of the High Court in Pretoria, it was the National Commissioner of Correctional Services who approached the Supreme Court of Appeal to set aside that particular judgment of the High Court. And Mr. Zuma then joined to become the second appellant in the Supreme Court of Appeal. Obviously, the Helen Suzman Foundation and the DA and others who have an interest there oppose that particular application in the Supreme Court of Appeal. Now, and I want to read a short line here in section or paragraph 60, where the Supreme Court of Appeal is saying that, firstly, as you heard, before I read, as you heard the acting Justice Makgoka saying that order number 5 has been set aside. That is the specific order that was saying that the time that Mr. Zuma spent outside while on medical parole does not form part of the sentencing. So the Supreme Court of Appeal is saying, look, it's not up to us as the Supreme Court of Appeal to determine how he is serving that particular sentence. It's up to the executive, which is the minister. Now, what it means is that according to paragraph 60, Mr. Zuma, since that particular paragraph order has now been set aside by the Supreme Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court of Appeal said he must go back to prison. But chances are that he will not go there, Sally. Why? Because the department, which has the authority and the final say on whether he goes back, has already issued a media statement to say that he has completed his sentence. He's no longer in their correctional system. So they possibly will issue out a statement soon in the coming days to clarify this. But we spoke to a legal advisor who also indicated that it doesn't necessarily mean that Mr. Zuma is going to go to prison, primarily because he now qualifies to be out on ordinary parole, let alone the medical parole that has been set aside. Let's listen to Mr. Motlong there.
Look, the judgment is quite clear that Mr. Zuma shouldn't go, he's not going to go back to prison. If you look into the ruling, paragraphs 5 and 6 of the ruling of the High Court ruling has been set aside.
That's order 5 and 6.
5 and 6, they have been set aside, and what that means is that in terms of order 5, it meant that the Mr. Zuma had to, complete the remainder of his sentence. Now it means then that falls away. Effectively, what it means is that the appeal has been dismissed. Then it means it asserts and confirm the very same arguments of the respondent in as far as the rationality and lawfulness of the decision is concerned. That decision by Mr. Arthur Fraser has been declared unlawful by the High Court, and this has been confirmed by the Supreme Court of Appeal.
Okay, so long and the short of it, it doesn't look like the former president is going back to jail anytime soon. Nonetheless, quite a blow in court today. Thank you so much for bringing us all those details, Moloto.